During the summer of 1350, if you were to pass through the village of Warham Percy in Yorkshire, you would find doors still open, tools propped against walls, clothes still folded on beds. But no voices, no footsteps, no one. The families who had lived here for 600 years were gone. Across England, over 3,000 villages would meet the same fate. Some would never be inhabited again. Walk further, and you would see the same scene everywhere. Fields choked with thistle and wild grass, the smell of wood smoke from chimneys that no one tended, the wind through empty doorways, the creak of a gate on its hinge, the distant cry of crows circling rooftops where no one lived. In this video, I used AI to reconstruct what England may have looked like in these years. It's not perfect, but I hope it helps you see what they saw. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these villages in that first summer after the plague. The harvest is rotting in the fields. The church bell hasn't rung in months. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks. One of the few sounds of life left. The same land remained. The same crops needed harvesting. The same lords expected their rents. But now, there were half as many hands to do the work. Before the plague, if you had been born a peasant, you would die a peasant. Your father had worked the same land, for the same lord, under the same terms. You could not leave. You could not bargain. You took what you were given and you were grateful for it. But stand in an English village in 1355, and you would feel something had shifted. The fields still needed plowing. The harvest still needed bringing in. But now, walk into any manor and you would see the same scene. A lord sat across from men who, 5 years earlier, would never have dared look him in the eye. And those men were negotiating. In villages like Cuxham in Oxfordshire, ploughmen who had earned 2 shillings before the plague were now demanding 10. And they were getting it. Because what choice did the landlord have? The next village was offering more. The town beyond that was offering freedom. If you stood on the roads leading out of the countryside, you would see families carrying everything they owned, walking toward the cities. London, York, Bristol, places where, if you could survive for a year and a day, no lord could claim you again. The air in these towns smelled of opportunity, of tanneries and forges and market squares crowded with people who had arrived with nothing and were building new lives. For the first time in centuries, the people at the bottom were moving. If you were a lord in 1351, the world was falling apart. Walk through the halls of any English manor and you would hear the same conversations, the same outrage. Peasants demanding wages that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Serfs abandoning the land their families had worked for generations. Villages half empty and the ones who stayed growing bolder by the month. Something had to be done. In the summer of 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, the harshest law England had seen in living memory. Every able-bodied man and woman under 60 was required to work. Wages were frozen at what they had been before the plague. No worker could leave their employer to seek better pay elsewhere. Those who refused faced imprisonment. Those who ran were branded. Imagine the scene in a village square when the new law was read aloud, the silence that followed, the looks exchanged between men who had, just months before, been tasting something like freedom. Royal commissioners traveled from village to village, holding courts, making examples. You would see men pulled from their homes in chains for asking a better wage, runaways dragged back to their lords, a mark burned into their skin. But here is what the lords discovered. You can chain a man to the land, but you cannot make him work well. The grain came in late. Tools broke and were not repaired. Crops rotted in the fields while the workers who were supposed to tend them moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes cast down but their message clear. The law had teeth, but so did the silence beneath it. For 30 years, England held its breath. If you walked into a village alehouse in the 1360s or 1370s, you would find it crowded with men who spoke differently than their fathers had. The plague had taken rich and poor alike. They had all seen it. The priest who had preached obedience had died screaming, just like the beggar in the ditch. And yet here they were, the survivors, still being told to bow, still being told to accept their place. The conversations were quiet, but they were everywhere, in alehouses, in the fields, at the edge of the churchyard after Mass. Why should a man be tied to the land when the land needed him more than he needed it? Why should wages be frozen when there were not enough hands to bring in the harvest? Who made these laws, and for whose benefit? Outside the alehouses, the world was getting harder. England was losing its war with France. The great victories of an earlier generation, Crécy, Poitiers, were fading into memory. Now there were only defeats, and rumors of French ships raiding the southern coast, and all of it had to be paid for. In 1377, the crown imposed a new tax, 4 pence from every adult in the kingdom, not based on wealth, but simply for existing. In 1379, another. And then in 1380, the demand tripled, 12 pence. A week's wages for a laborer. The same amount from the duke in his castle and the widow in her cottage. Imagine a tax collector arriving in a village in the spring of 1381. The lists said there should be 200 adults. The village produced 60. Where were the others? Hiding in the woods, sent to relatives in the next county, simply refusing to be counted. Beneath the silence, something was breaking. In early June 1381, the roads of England filled with people. If you had stood at a crossroads in Essex or Kent, you would have seen something no one alive had ever witnessed. Not an army, not in the way anyone understood the word. These were farmers, craftsmen, village blacksmiths. They carried scythes and axes and longbows that had hung above fireplaces since the French wars. They walked in groups of 10, then 50, then hundreds, pouring out of villages and joining the streams of others heading the same direction. The air smelled of dust and sweat and something else, a kind of electricity that comes when people who have been silent for a lifetime suddenly find their voice. In the villages they passed through, you would see manor houses burning against the evening sky, not looted, burned. Court rolls and tax records thrown into the flames, the parchment curling and blackening as generations of debt and bondage turned to ash. This was not theft. This was erasure. Imagine standing in the crowd as it swelled to tens of thousands. You would see old men who had never left their parish walking beside young men with nothing to lose. At night, they slept in fields and shared bread. By mid-June, the columns converged on London. If you had been standing on the city walls, you would have seen them coming, a mass of humanity stretching back along the roads as far as the eye could see. The gates opened. Whether by force or by sympathy, no one could say for certain. For 3 days, the largest city in England belonged to the people who had built it. Imagine standing in the streets of London in those June days. The city smelled of smoke. The Savoy Palace, the most magnificent house in England, home of the king's uncle, was a pile of charred rubble. The rebels had burned it to the ground, but forbidden anyone to steal from it. This was not about plunder. This was about justice. In the Tower of London, a 14-year-old king watched the city burn. Richard II had inherited the crown as a child. Now, the men who had run the kingdom on his behalf were being dragged from their hiding places and killed in the streets. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Treasurer, their heads mounted on spikes and paraded through the cheering crowds. On June 15th, the king rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, just outside the city walls. If you had been there, you would have seen an extraordinary scene. Thousands of armed peasants on one side, a handful of nobles, and the boy king on the other. The fate of England balanced on the edge of a blade. The rebel leader stepped forward to speak. Accounts say he was bold, even familiar with the king, reaching out to shake his hand, calling him brother. He laid out their demands: an end to serfdom, fair wages, pardons for all. What happened next was chaos, a scuffle, a sword drawn. The rebel leader fell from his horse, bleeding. For a moment, the crowd surged forward, bows raised. And then the king, 14 years old, alone in front of an army that could have torn him apart, rode toward them. "Follow me," he called out. "I am your captain now. I will give you what you seek." The crowd hesitated, and then, slowly, they followed. It was a trap, or perhaps simply a promise no king could keep. Within weeks, the pardons were revoked. Royal armies swept through Essex and Kent, hunting down anyone who had marched on London. Over 1,500 men were executed that summer. The rebel leaders were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their bodies displayed as warnings in the villages that had sent them. The old order had survived, but it had been shaken in ways that could not be undone. The poll tax was never collected again, not for another 600 years. The laws that bound peasants to the land remained on the books, but enforcing them became harder with each passing decade. Lords who pushed too hard found their workers gone by morning. By 1500, serfdom in England had quietly disappeared. The men and women who marched on London in 1381 did not live to see the world they fought for, but they had proven something that would not be forgotten, that the people who worked the land were no longer willing to suffer in silence.